You were a senior, one class away from graduation, when you realized you were failing Professor Carter's course, and the panic that set in was unlike anything you'd experienced in 4 years of college. This wasn't just another class you could retake next semester or a minor setback you could recover from. This was Advanced Statistical Methods, a required course for your major, only offered once a year, taught by only one professor, Dr. Richard Carter. Your diploma, your job offer at a marketing firm that started in June, your entire future hinged on passing this one class. You'd checked your grade obsessively on the student portal, watching it drop from a C to AD to an F over the course of the semester, each assignment seemingly graded more harshly than the last. The numbers didn't lie. You were failing, and with only 3 weeks left in the semester, the math was brutal. Even if you aced the final exam, you'd end up with a D- at best, which still wasn't passing in your major. It wasn't just about bad grades. You'd been dealing with a family crisis all semester, and the timing couldn't have been worse for your final year of college. Your mom had been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer in late August, right as the fall semester began. The woman who'd worked 2 jobs to put you through college, who'd never missed a single one of your school events growing up, who'd been your biggest cheerleader through every challenge, was suddenly facing the biggest fight of her life. The diagnosis had come out of nowhere. She'd gone in for a routine mammogram, and 2 weeks later was starting aggressive chemotherapy. You tried to balance everything at first, convinced you could handle your course load while being there for your family, but cancer didn't care about your academic schedule or your carefully laid plans for graduation. You were working 2 jobs to help with medical bills, and the financial pressure was crushing in ways you'd never anticipated. Your mom's insurance covered some of the treatment, but the copays, deductibles, and various medications added up faster than you could process. Your dad worked in construction, and his income was already stretched thin supporting your younger sister who was still in high school. So you'd taken on extra shifts at both your campus library job and your weekend position at a restaurant, working 35 to 40 hours a week on top of your full course load. Every paycheck went straight to helping your parents, and you'd maxed out your one credit card covering gas money to drive home and groceries your mom could actually stomach during chemo. Sleep became a luxury you couldn't afford, and studying became something you did in stolen moments between shifts and family emergencies, and you'd missed several classes during her worst days. The days when she was so sick from treatment that she couldn't get out of bed, when your dad was at work and your sister was at school and you were the only one who could be there. Professor Carter had an attendance policy clearly stated in the syllabus. Miss more than 3 classes and your final grade dropped a full letter. You'd missed 6. 3 of those absences were the days after your mom's surgery, when complications kept her in the hospital longer than expected, and you'd slept in an uncomfortable chair by her bed, afraid to leave in case something went wrong. 2 more were on days when she'd had particularly brutal chemo sessions and you'd stayed home to help her to the bathroom and hold her hair when she was sick and remind her that this would pass, that she was strong enough to survive this. One absence was the day you'd been so exhausted you'd fallen asleep at a red light on your way to campus and nearly caused an accident. You went to his office hours, vulnerable and honest, explaining your situation and begging for a chance to make up the work. And the walk to his office felt like the longest walk of your life. Professor Carter's office was on the 3rd floor of the psychology building, a corner office with actual windows and bookshelves lining every wall, the kind of space that signaled his status as a tenured professor with 20 years at the university. You'd put this conversation off for weeks, telling yourself you could turn things around without having to ask for help, without having to expose your personal struggles to a professor who had a reputation for being strict and unsympathetic. But the F staring back at you from the grade portal had forced your hand. It was Tuesday afternoon, his posted office hours, and you'd practiced what you were going to say a dozen times on the drive over, trying to find words that would make him understand without sounding like you were making excuses. His door was partially open when you arrived, and you could see him sitting at his desk typing on his computer, silver reading glasses perched on his nose. Professor Carter was in his late 40s, well-dressed in the way academics who took themselves seriously always were, with graying hair and the kind of confidence that came from decades of holding power over students' futures. You knocked softly, your heart pounding so hard you could feel it in your throat. He looked up, seemed to register who you were after a moment, and gestured for you to come in without much enthusiasm. "Close the door," he said, turning his attention back to his computer screen. "I assume this is about your grade." The dismissive tone made you want to turn around and leave, but you forced yourself to sit in the chair across from his desk, hands clasped in your lap to keep them from shaking. You offered to do extra credit, retake exams, anything to pass this required course, and the words tumbled out faster than you intended. Your desperation obvious in every syllable. You explained about your mom's diagnosis, about the chemotherapy and the surgery and the complications. You talked about working 2 jobs and missing sleep and trying your best to keep up with coursework, but falling behind despite your efforts. You showed him documentation, the hospital paperwork with your mom's treatment dates, the letter from her oncologist confirming her diagnosis and treatment schedule, even a copy of your work schedules to prove you weren't just making excuses. You told him you understood you'd violated the attendance policy and that your test scores were low, but you were asking for mercy, for any possible way to demonstrate that you'd learned the material even if your grades didn't reflect it. "I'll do extra assignments. I'll retake any exam you want. I'll come to every single office hour for the rest of the semester," you said, hearing the pleading tone in your voice and hating it but unable to stop. "I just need to pass this class to graduate, please." You needed a D to graduate, just barely passing, and you made sure he understood that you weren't asking for an A or even a B. You just needed the absolute minimum to walk across that stage in May and collect the diploma your mother was fighting to stay alive to see. "I don't need a good grade," you said, trying to make eye contact even though he was still barely looking at you. "I just need to pass." A D- would be enough. I have a job lined up that starts in June, and I can't defer graduation or take this class again next year because you only teach it in spring. This is my only shot. You laid out the math for him, showing him that even with your current F, if he'd allow you to make up some of the missed assignments, and if you did well on the final exam, you could mathematically scrape together enough points for a D. It was possible. It would require him to show some flexibility with his policies, but it was mathematically possible. Professor Carter listened with what seemed like sympathy, nodding along as you explained everything, and for a few minutes, you allowed yourself to hope that this might actually work. He made appropriate facial expressions at the right moments, a frown when you mentioned your mom's diagnosis, a thoughtful nod when you showed him the hospital paperwork, a sympathetic tilt of his head when you talked about working 2 jobs. He let you finish your entire explanation without interrupting, which you took as a good sign. When you finally stopped talking, exhausted from the emotional effort of laying your life bare before this man who held your future in his hands, there was a long moment of silence. He took off his reading glasses and set them on his desk, then steepled his fingers together in front of his face like he was carefully considering everything you'd said. Then his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, and you felt the temperature in the room shift. The sympathetic professor face was replaced by something else, something calculating and cold that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He leaned back in his chair, that expensive leather chair that probably cost more than a month of your mom's medications, and regarded you with a look you couldn't quite read but instinctively didn't like. The silence stretched out uncomfortably long, and you found yourself fidgeting with the strap of your backpack, waiting for him to say something, anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, still professional on the surface, but with an undertone that made your stomach clench with unease. He leaned back in his chair and said the words that would change everything. I might be able to help you, but you'll need to help me first. The sentence hung in the air between you, seemingly innocuous on the surface but weighted with implication. Your brain tried to interpret it in the most innocent way possible. Maybe he needed a research assistant. Maybe he wanted you to volunteer for some department project. Maybe he was offering a work-study arrangement where you'd earn your grade through legitimate academic labor. But something about the way he said it, the slight emphasis on help me, the way his eyes lingered on you just a beat too long, made it clear this wasn't about filing papers or helping with research. You'd heard stories from other students, whispers in the library, and vague warnings passed between friends, about professors who leveraged their power for personal gain. You'd always told yourself those stories were exaggerated, that predatory professors were rare and surely you'd never encounter one. But sitting in that office, watching Professor Carter's expression shift from professional to something else entirely, you realized you'd been naive. The way he said it made your stomach drop. That visceral physical reaction your body had before your mind had fully processed what was happening. Your mouth went dry and your palms started sweating and you felt simultaneously hot and cold, like your body was preparing for fight or flight even though you were just sitting in an office on a Tuesday afternoon. What do you mean? You asked, even though some part of you already knew, already understood that whatever he was about to propose would cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. You wanted him to say something innocent, wanted to be wrong about the implication you'd heard in his voice. But Professor Carter just smiled. Not the warm smile of a mentor helping a struggling student, but something else entirely. Something that made you acutely aware that his door was now closed, and his office was at the end of a hallway that was mostly empty during office hours. We'll discuss the details, he said, standing up from his desk in a way that felt dismissive, like the meeting was over now that he'd planted his seed of suggestion. Think about how badly you want to graduate. Think about your mother, about that job you mentioned, about everything you stand to lose if you fail this class. Then come back Thursday during office hours and we'll talk about an arrangement that benefits both of us. He opened the door for you, a gesture that seemed polite but felt more like being shown out before you could ask questions or push back. You stood on shaky legs, grabbing your backpack, your mind racing to understand what had just happened and what he was actually proposing. As you walked past him through the doorway, he added in a voice just above a whisper, "And don't mention this conversation to anyone. These kinds of arrangements require discretion." You walked out of that office in a daze, his words echoing in your head as you made your way down the hallway and out of the building. The spring sunshine felt too bright. The students laughing and talking around you felt like they were in a different universe. Everything seemed surreal and distant, like you were watching your own life from outside your body. You sat in your car for 20 minutes before you could drive, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to decide if what just happened was really what you thought it was, or if you were reading too much into an awkward conversation. But the sick feeling in your stomach wouldn't go away, and you absolutely knew, that Professor Carter had just propositioned you. He'd looked at your desperation, at your sick mother, and your financial struggles, and your fear of losing everything you'd worked for, and he'd seen an opportunity to exploit you. And the worst part, the part that made you want to scream or cry or both, was that you actually found yourself considering it. Whatever it was, whatever arrangement he was proposing, you actually caught yourself thinking, how bad could it be? And hating yourself for even having that thought. Professor Carter started making requests that had nothing to do with academics, and it began so gradually that you almost didn't notice the shift at first. You'd gone back to his office that Thursday like he'd told you to, still hoping against hope that you'd misunderstood his implications, that he was going to offer you something legitimate like tutoring other students or helping grade papers. Instead, he'd handed you a ticket stub with an address written on it and asked if you could pick something up for him after your shift at the restaurant that evening. My dry cleaning, he'd explained casually, as if this was a perfectly normal request from a professor to a student. The place closes at 7 and I won't be able to make it. Since you're asking for special consideration with your coursework, I think it's fair that you help me out with a few small tasks. Nothing major, just occasionally running an errand here and there when I'm too busy. First, it was running personal errands, picking up his dry cleaning, getting his coffee before class, even walking his dog on weekends. And each request came with the unspoken reminder that your grade depended on your cooperation. The dry cleaning pickup became a weekly thing, always at times that were inconvenient for you, always requiring you to drive 15 minutes out of your way to a specific cleaner he preferred. Then he started texting you in the mornings, asking you to stop by the coffee shop near campus and bring him a large black coffee with 2 sugars. Very specific about the brand and preparation, expecting you to deliver it to his office before your own classes started. You found yourself setting your alarm 30 minutes earlier just to accommodate this routine, paying for his expensive coffee with money you didn't have and that he never offered to reimburse you. For the dog walking started when he mentioned, casually, that he had a German Shepherd that needed exercise and his ex-wife who usually handled it was out of town. "You seem responsible," he'd said, handing you a key to his house without asking if you were willing. "Just an hour on Saturday morning. The dog needs a good walk and I have a conference to prepare for." That one-time favor became every weekend, and his house made you deeply uncomfortable. Too personal, too intimate, being in his space and seeing his life outside the professional environment of campus. His dog was sweet, at least, a gentle giant named Zeus, who was probably the only innocent party in this entire arrangement. But walking through Professor Carter's neighborhood, past his nice house in a nice area that your parents could never afford, holding his dog's leash, you felt like you were playing a role in a transaction you'd never explicitly agreed to. He framed it as helping out, since he was going out of his way to give you extra time on assignments. And the quid pro quo was always implicit, but never quite explicit enough that you could point to it as evidence of wrongdoing. "I'm being flexible with your deadlines," he'd remind you when handing you his laundry ticket or house key. "I think it's only fair that you're flexible in helping me manage my busy schedule. We're helping each other out here." The way he said it made it sound almost reasonable, like this was a normal mentorship arrangement, like professors and students exchanged favors all the time. But you knew other students in his class who were also struggling, and he wasn't asking them to pick up his dry cleaning or walk his dog. This arrangement was specific to you, specific to your desperation, and he'd calculated exactly how much you'd be willing to endure to avoid failing. You felt uncomfortable, but told yourself it was worth it to graduate. And you developed a mantra you'd repeat to yourself every time your phone buzzed with another request. Just a few more weeks. Just until finals. Just until you pass this class and never have to see him again. You told yourself that picking up dry cleaning wasn't that bad, that getting coffee was a minor inconvenience, that walking a dog was actually kind of pleasant if you didn't think about why you were doing it. You compartmentalized the discomfort, put it in a box labeled "things I'll deal with later," and focused on the end goal, passing this class, graduating on time, starting your job in June, making your mom proud before her next round of chemo started. Every time you felt degraded or used, you'd picture your mom's face at graduation, picture yourself in that cap and gown walking across the stage, and tell yourself it would all be worth it. Then the request got worse, escalating in a way that made it clear the errands had just been a test to see how far he could push you. About 3 weeks into this arrangement, Professor Carter sent you a text at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. "Need to discuss your progress on the final project. Can you come to my office in an hour?" Your stomach sank reading it because you knew the psychology building would be virtually empty at 11:30 at night, knew that whatever he wanted to discuss probably had nothing to do with your actual project. But you also knew that your project grade was worth 30% of your final grade, and if he decided to fail you on it, there'd be no mathematical way to pass the class even if you aced the final exam. So you texted back okay and drove back to campus, your hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to prepare yourself for whatever was coming. He asked you to come to his office late at night to discuss your progress when the building was empty, and these late-night meetings became another regular occurrence that made your skin crawl. The psychology building after hours was eerie, fluorescent lights humming in empty hallways, the echo of your footsteps too loud, the awareness that you were alone in a building with a man who had power over your future and clearly didn't respect normal boundaries. His office door would be open just a crack, light spilling into the dark hallway, and you'd knock softly before entering to find him at his desk, often with papers spread out that he'd claim were related to your coursework, but that he'd barely glance at during your meeting. These sessions would last an hour or more, and he'd keep you there talking about nothing: his research, his ex-wife, his opinions on university politics, subjects that had nothing to do with your grade or your project, but that you had to sit through and nod along with because leaving felt impossible. He made comments about your appearance, suggested you dress differently for your meetings, and the first time it happened, you'd almost convinced yourself you'd imagined it. You'd shown up to one of his late-night office sessions wearing your work uniform, black pants and a polo shirt from the restaurant, because you'd come straight from your shift. He'd looked you up and down slowly, taking his time in a way that made you want to cover yourself even though you were fully clothed, and said, "You should wear something more professional when we meet. A dress, maybe. You're a smart girl. You should present yourself better." The comment had stunned you into silence because what did your clothing have to do with discussing statistical methods? But the next time you'd met with him, you'd worn a dress from your closet, hating yourself for complying but too afraid of the consequences to refuse. That had opened the floodgates for more commentary about your appearance. He'd comment on your hair, "I like it better when you wear it down." He'd notice when you wore makeup, "That's better. You look more put together." Once, horrifyingly, he'd said, "You're actually quite attractive when you make an effort. I bet you could really turn heads if you wanted to." The comments made you feel dirty, made you hyper-aware of your body in a way you'd never been in an academic setting, made every meeting feel like you were being evaluated on criteria that had nothing to do with your intellect or your coursework. You started dressing more conservatively, trying to hide yourself, but that just led to comments about how you shouldn't hide your figure and how confidence was attractive. There was no winning. No way to dress that didn't invite his assessment and commentary. He started texting you at all hours, expecting immediate responses, and your phone became a source of constant anxiety. Messages would come at 7 in the morning, during your classes, during your shifts at work, late at night when you were studying or trying to sleep. Sometimes they were about legitimate things. Did you finish the reading for Thursday? But increasingly they were personal. He'd send you articles he found interesting and expect you to read them and respond with thoughtful commentary. He'd text you about his day, about frustrations with colleagues, about his divorce settlement, treating you like a friend or therapist rather than a student. And he'd get irritated if you didn't respond quickly enough, sending follow-up texts. Or did you see my message? Or I guess you're too busy to respond to the person determining your grade. The expectation of constant availability was exhausting and intrusive, bleeding into every aspect of your life. You'd be at your mom's house trying to have dinner with your family during a good day between her treatments, and your phone would buzz with his messages demanding attention. You'd be at work trying to focus on taking orders and serving customers, and you'd have to sneak looks at your phone to make sure you hadn't missed something from him. You started sleeping with your phone on loud, afraid you'd miss a late-night text and face consequences the next day. Your friends noticed you were always on your phone, always distracted, always tense when a notification came through, but you couldn't explain to them what was happening because you barely understood it yourself and couldn't imagine how to articulate the wrongness of it all. When you tried to set boundaries, he'd casually mention how he was reconsidering whether you deserved to pass, wielding your grade like a weapon to keep you compliant. The first time you pushed back when he'd texted at 2 in the morning, asking you to proofread an email he was sending to the department chair, and you'd responded that you were sleeping and could look at it in the morning. He'd been ice cold in class the next day. He'd called on you repeatedly, asking questions he knew you couldn't answer, making you look incompetent in front of your classmates. After class, he'd pulled you aside and said, "I stayed up late helping you with your grade calculations last night, working on ways to help you pass. I thought we had an understanding about helping each other out. Maybe I was wrong about your commitment." The threat was clear: comply or fail. Another time, when you told him you couldn't walk his dog one weekend because you were driving home to take your mom to a doctor's appointment, he'd responded, "I see. Well, I hope you understand that flexibility goes both ways. I've been flexible with your attendance and deadlines, but if you can't be flexible with simple requests, I'll have to reconsider my accommodations." Then he'd mentioned in his next text that he was grading your midterm project and was on the fence about whether it met the standards for passing work. The message was unmistakable: prioritize his needs or watch your grade plummet. You'd ended up asking your dad to take your mom to the appointment so you could walk the damn dog, and you'd cried the entire drive back to campus, feeling like the worst daughter in the world for choosing a professor's pet over your own mother. You felt trapped. If you refused, you'd fail and lose everything, and the walls were closing in from all sides with no clear path to escape. Every day you woke up feeling sick with anxiety, dreading the inevitable text messages, the next request, the next boundary that would be pushed. You'd lie in bed calculating and recalculating your grade possibilities, trying to figure out if you could somehow pass without continuing this arrangement, but the math was cruel and unforgiving. With the points you'd already lost from absences and low test scores, you needed Professor Carter's cooperation to have any shot at passing. He could grade your remaining assignments harshly and ensure your failure, or he could be generous with partial credit and get you to that magic D-. Your future was entirely in his hands, and he knew it and used it deliberately. If you reported him, who would believe you over a tenured professor? This question haunted you every time you considered going to someone for help. You'd look up the Title IX office website, read about reporting procedures, but then you'd remember that Professor Carter was respected, published, a fixture at this university for 2 decades. You were a struggling student with poor grades who'd been asking for special treatment. How would you prove any of this? The text could be interpreted as a professor being available to help a student. The errands could be dismissed as voluntary favors. The late-night meetings were documented in his calendar as office hours. Everything that felt wrong and inappropriate to you could be reframed as innocuous if viewed through a different lens. And who was going to take your word over his? You'd heard stories about students who'd reported professors and had been labeled troublemakers, who'd faced retaliation and ostracism, who'd been forced to leave the university because the process of fighting was more destructive than the original harm. You'd heard about investigations that went nowhere, about professors who got a slap on the wrist and then made the rest of their accuser's academic career miserable. The power imbalance was so massive, so thoroughly in his favor, that the idea of reporting felt less like seeking justice and more like committing academic suicide. And you were so close to graduation, just weeks away, and reporting him would probably mean not graduating on time even if you were eventually vindicated. The timing made fighting back feel impossible, so you went along with it, hating yourself more each day, and the self-loathing was almost worse than the actual tasks he demanded. You'd pick up his dry cleaning and feel disgusted with yourself for complying. You'd sit in his office late at night while he rambled about his personal life and hate yourself for not walking out. You'd respond to his 2 a.m. text messages and despise the person you'd become who'd let a professor have this much access to her life. You looked at yourself in the mirror and didn't recognize who was looking back, this anxious, defeated person who'd compromised every boundary and principle she had just to get a degree. You thought about the person you'd been freshman year, idealistic and excited about learning. and felt like you'd betrayed her completely. Every interaction with Professor Carter chipped away at your sense of self, at your dignity, at your understanding of who you were and what you stood for. You'd always considered yourself strong, someone who stood up for herself, someone who wouldn't tolerate being treated poorly. But here you were, tolerating things that made you sick to your stomach, and the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. You'd justify it by telling yourself it was temporary, that you could endure anything for a few weeks, that keeping your head down and graduating was the smart, strategic choice. But late at night, unable to sleep, you'd wonder what you were really learning from your college education, if the main lesson was that powerful men could exploit you and you'd just accept it because fighting back was too costly. The worst part was watching yourself become numb to it all, feeling your baseline for acceptable behavior shift in ways that scared you. Things that would have shocked you 2 months ago. Being alone with him late at night, having him comment on your body, running his personal errands, had become your new normal. You'd stopped being surprised or outraged and had moved into a kind of grim acceptance, and that acceptance felt like losing a piece of yourself. You knew you were being used and manipulated, but you'd convinced yourself you were making a rational choice given impossible circumstances. Some part of you knew that this was exactly how abusers operated, gradually, incrementally, pushing boundaries until the victim couldn't remember where the line had been in the first place. But knowing it intellectually didn't help you figure out how to escape it. And through it all, you had to maintain a normal facade with everyone else in your life. Your parents couldn't know because your mom had enough to worry about with her cancer, and your dad would probably drive to campus and confront Professor Carter, which would only make everything worse. Your friends couldn't know because you were ashamed and didn't know how to explain that you'd let this happen, that you'd been complicit in your own exploitation by not saying no from the beginning. In class, you had to sit there and pretend to be a normal student while your professor called on you knowing exactly where you'd been the night before and what degrading tasks you'd performed to stay in his good graces. The performance of normalcy was exhausting, and you felt like you were living a double life. The competent, together student everyone saw, and the desperate, compromised person you actually were. Everything came to a head when Professor Carter called you to his home under the pretense of reviewing your final project, and the invitation itself should have been the clearest red flag. The moment you should have said no and walked away from the entire situation. It was a Thursday evening, 2 weeks before finals, and you were at the library desperately trying to finish the research project that was worth 30% of your grade, AT, comprehensive statistical analysis of consumer behavior patterns that you'd actually worked hard on despite everything else happening. Your phone buzzed with his text. Need to review your final project tonight. Several concerns about your methodology. Come to my house at 8 p.m. Will be easier to spread out materials and really dig into the data. Address is 427 Maple Grove. Your stomach immediately nodded because meeting at his house crossed yet another line. Yet another boundary that shouldn't be crossed. But he'd framed it as academic necessity. When you arrived, he opened the door with wine and made it clear this wasn't about academics, and the pretense evaporated within seconds of stepping inside. He was wearing casual clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, not his usual professor attire, and he held a glass of red wine in one hand as he opened the door with the other. Come in, he said, his voice different than it was on campus, more familiar, more intimate. The house was dimly lit, and you could see he'd set out 2 wine glasses on the coffee table in his living room, a bottle already opened and breathing. Your project materials were nowhere in sight. No laptop open, no papers spread out, no indication this was actually going to be a working session. The playlist in the background was jazz, something smooth and romantic, completely inappropriate for what was supposed to be a student-professor meeting about statistical methodology. I don't drink, you said. Still standing in the doorway, every instinct screaming at you to leave but your feet frozen to the spot. And I thought we were reviewing my project. I brought my laptop with all the data. You held up your bag like evidence, like you could somehow force this situation back into the academic realm where it belonged. Professor Carter smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, and closed the door behind you. We'll get to that, he said smoothly. But first, let's talk about where we stand. You and me, I mean. This arrangement we've had. He gestured to the couch, indicating you should sit, and reluctantly you did, perching on the edge with your bag clutched in your lap like a shield. He sat next to you, closer than necessary, close enough that you could smell his cologne and the wine on his breath. He told you directly that if you wanted to pass, you needed to be more accommodating, and there was no ambiguity left. No room for misinterpretation. No way to pretend you'd misunderstood his intentions. Look, he said, setting his wine glass down and turning to face you fully. I've been very patient with you. Very generous with my time and my grading. I've given you extensions, I've overlooked your absences, I've created opportunities for you to improve your grade. But I need to see that you're truly committed to doing what it takes to pass this class. His hand moved to your knee as he said this, and you flinched but didn't move away because your body had gone into some kind of shock, frozen between flight and disbelief. I'm not a bad guy, he continued. I'm not asking for anything crazy. Just a little appreciation. A little acknowledgement of everything I'm doing for you. The implication was crystal clear, and you felt sick. Physically nauseous with the realization of what he was actually demanding. This wasn't about picking up dry cleaning anymore or walking his dog or getting his coffee. This was about your body, about sex, about him using his power to coerce you into something that made your skin crawl. The room seemed to tilt and your vision went blurry at the edges and you couldn't quite catch your breath. His hand was still on your knee, starting to move higher, and suddenly the weeks of uncomfortable requests and boundary violations snapped into focus as exactly what they'd been. Grooming, systematic desensitization, slowly escalating demands designed to get you to this exact moment where he could make this explicit demand and you'd already be so compromised. So complicit in the earlier violations that saying no would feel impossible. I can't, you stammered, finally finding your voice even though it came out weak and shaky. Professor Carter, I just want to pass your class. I need to graduate. This isn't. You couldn't even articulate what this was. Couldn't find words for the horror and betrayal and disgust coursing through you. His expression hardened immediately, the friendly pretense dropping away to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. Don't be naive, he said, his voice taking on an edge. You think you've been running my errands out of the goodness of your heart? You think I've been giving you special treatment for free? This is how the world works. You want something, you give something? I want to pass your class. I need you to cooperate. You refused and tried to leave, standing up so abruptly that you nearly knocked over the coffee table, your bag falling to the floor as you scrambled to your feet. No, you said, louder now, finding strength in the word even though your whole body was shaking. No, I'm not doing this. This is wrong. You're my professor. You can't ask me to do this. You moved toward the door, desperate to get out of this house, away from this man. But your legs felt weak and uncoordinated, and your hands were trembling so badly you could barely grab your bag from where it had fallen. Professor Carter stood too, and suddenly he was between you and the door, blocking your path with his body, and the situation escalated from uncomfortable to genuinely frightening. But he blocked the door, saying you were throwing away your future over nothing, and his physical presence in your path made your heart race with real fear. The kind of fear that comes from recognizing you might not be safe, might not be able to leave even though you desperately needed to. Move, you said, trying to keep your voice steady. I want to leave. Let me leave. But he didn't move, just stood there with his arms crossed, looking at you with a mixture of frustration and something darker. You're being dramatic, he said, his tone dismissive. I'm offering you a simple exchange. One night, a few hours, and you pass my class. You graduate. You get your precious job and your whole future. Or you walk out of here, you fail, and everything you've worked for, everything your sick mother has sacrificed for, goes down the drain. Over what? Over being prudish? Over some outdated sense of morality? The mention of your mother was a step too far, using her illness as leverage to coerce you into sex, and something in you snapped. All the weeks of degradation, of running his errands and tolerating his comments and responding to his late-night texts, all the times you'd swallowed your discomfort and told yourself it was worth it, all of that crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. This was never going to stop. If you gave in now, he'd have complete power over you. He'd have proof of your willing participation that he could use to discredit you if you ever tried to report him. And there would always be another demand, another accommodation required, another boundary crossed. The only way out was to refuse, to draw a line even if it cost you everything you'd been working toward. You pushed past him and left, using physical force for the first time, shoving him hard enough that he stumbled backward and you could grab the doorknob and wrench it open. You're making a huge mistake, he shouted after you as you ran to your car, his voice following you into the night. You think anyone will believe you? You think you can prove any of this? You'll fail my class and tank your GPA and no one will hire you and it'll all be your own fault. His words were designed to scare you, to make you come back and reconsider. But you were already in your car, fumbling with your keys, your hands shaking so badly you could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine started and you pulled away from his house, watching in the rearview mirror as he stood in his doorway, silhouetted by the light from inside, and you had never felt more afraid or more certain that you'd just changed the trajectory of your entire life. Driving home with shaking hands and tears streaming down your face, the 20-minute drive back to your apartment was the longest drive of your life. You couldn't stop crying, great gasping sobs that made it hard to see the road, and twice you had to pull over because you were hyperventilating and couldn't breathe properly. Your whole body was shaking with adrenaline and shock and the delayed fear of what had almost happened, what he'd been demanding, what you'd narrowly escaped. You kept replaying the scene, his hand on your knee, his words about accommodation, the way he'd blocked the door, the cold calculation in his eyes when he'd mentioned your mother. You felt violated even though he hadn't actually touched you beyond that hand on your knee, felt dirty and used and compromised in ways you couldn't articulate. That night you barely slept, knowing you'd probably just guaranteed your own failure, and the hours between midnight and dawn were the darkest of your life. You lay in bed staring at the ceiling, playing out scenarios in your mind. Could you report him? Would anyone believe you? The texts he'd sent could be interpreted as innocent. The errands could be dismissed as you volunteering. Meeting at his house could be framed as your choice. And now you'd be a failing student with a grudge, trying to take down a respected professor because you were upset about your grade. Every scenario you imagined ended with you being disbelieved, discredited, humiliated publicly, while he faced no real consequences. But the alternative, saying nothing, accepting the F, losing everything, felt equally impossible. You thought about your mom, imagined having to tell her you weren't graduating, that all her sacrifices had been for nothing. She'd been so proud when you'd been accepted to college, had worked double shifts to help pay for your books and supplies, had told everyone at her job about her daughter who was going to be the first in the family to get a degree. Even through her chemo treatments, even when she was so sick she could barely lift her head, she'd ask about your classes and tell you how proud she was. The thought of disappointing her, of her not being able to attend your graduation because you'd failed one class, was crushing. But the thought of telling her you'd passed because you'd slept with your professor would kill her. There was no good option, no path forward that didn't involve devastating loss. The next day in class, he ignored you completely, and the silent treatment was somehow worse than his previous attention. You dragged yourself to his 9 a.m. lecture, exhausted and hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, half hoping he'd have some change of heart, or that the previous night would somehow have not happened. But when you walked in, he looked right through you like you didn't exist. He didn't call on you when you raised your hand. He didn't make eye contact. When other students asked him questions after class, he was warm and helpful, but when you approached him to ask about the final exam, he literally turned his back and walked away. The message was clear. You were dead to him, and by extension, your grade was dead too. When grades were posted, you'd received an F on the final project you'd worked on for weeks, and seeing that grade appear on the student portal felt like a physical blow. You'd spent over 80 hours on that project, conducting surveys, analyzing data, creating visualizations, writing up a comprehensive report that detailed every step of your methodology and every finding. It was good work. You knew it was good work. Your previous projects had received B's and C's, and this one was significantly better, more thorough, more sophisticated in its analysis. But there it was, F. No feedback, no explanation, just a grade that meant failure. You clicked through to the comments section hoping for some justification, some specific critique that would explain this grade, but the comments field was empty. He'd simply failed you, giving you no points, no partial credit, nothing. Your final grade, F, you wouldn't be graduating. The math was simple and brutal. With a 0 on the final project and your already low test scores, there was no possible way to pass the class even if you scored perfectly on the final exam. The portal confirmed it, showing your overall grade as 52%, an F. You stared at the screen until the letters blurred, unable to process that 4 years of work, thousands of dollars in student loans, countless sacrifices from your family. All of it was gone because of one man's revenge for being refused. You thought about the job offer you'd have to decline, the explanation you'd have to give about why you weren't graduating on time. You thought about having to tell your parents, having to watch your mom's face fall when she learned you wouldn't be walking across the stage in May after all. Your family's sacrifices, your mom's encouragement to finish school despite everything. All of it felt wasted because you'd refused one man's disgusting demands, and the unfairness of it was staggering. Your parents had refinanced their house to help pay for your education. Your dad had worked overtime for years, missing family dinners and your sister's school events because he was picking up extra shifts to cover your tuition. Your mom had delayed her own medical care, had ignored symptoms for months because she didn't want to burden the family with medical bills while you were still in school. She'd been diagnosed with stage 3 cancer partly because she'd waited too long to get that lump checked out, had been prioritizing your education over her own health. And now it was all for nothing because you'd refused to be sexually coerced by a man with power over your academic future. All of it felt wasted, and the guilt was crushing. You called your mom that evening and told her you weren't graduating, though you couldn't tell her why. You said you'd failed a required course, that you'd be able to retake it in the fall and graduate in December instead. Her voice on the phone, weak from her most recent chemo treatment, had been so understanding and supportive that it made you cry harder. "That's okay, honey," she'd said. "December graduation will be just as special. I'll be there no matter what. I'm so proud of you for not giving up." She didn't know you felt like you had given up, that you'd spent weeks compromising yourself, and it still hadn't been enough. That you'd drawn the line too late, and now everyone was paying the price for your professor's vindictiveness. Because you'd refused one man's disgusting demands, your entire future was in ruins, and the injustice of it radicalized something in you. You'd spent the weeks of his escalating demands telling yourself to keep your head down, to endure, to prioritize survival and graduation over fighting back. But now, having lost everything anyway, having that awful outcome you'd been trying to avoid happen regardless of your compliance, you realized you had nothing left to lose. He'd taken your graduation, your job, your peace of mind, your sense of safety on campus. The only thing left was your integrity, your truth, your ability to make sure he didn't do this to someone else. And suddenly that mattered more than anything else. If you were going to fail anyway, if your future was already destroyed, then at least you could try to protect the next desperate student who walked into his office begging for help. That night, lying in bed, unable to sleep for the second night in a row, you made a decision. You weren't going to let Professor Carter get away with this. You weren't going to protect his reputation at the cost of your own dignity and the safety of future students. It would be hard and scary and might not work, might end with you being publicly humiliated and branded as a liar, but doing nothing felt worse than any of those possibilities. So you got up, turned on your laptop, and started documenting everything. Every text message he'd sent with timestamps, every errand he'd made you run with dates and locations, every inappropriate comment about your appearance, as close to verbatim as you could remember. Every late-night meeting in his empty office, the escalating pattern of behavior culminating in the explicit sexual demand at his house. You typed for hours, creating a timeline, organizing evidence, preparing to take on someone with infinitely more power than you, but finally ready to fight back. You spent 2 days in shock and despair before anger replaced the hopelessness, and that transformation from victim to fighter didn't happen dramatically or all at once. The first 2 days after seeing that F on your transcript were a blur of crying, sleeping, and staring at walls. You called in sick to both your jobs, ignored texts from friends, and barely ate. Your roommate asked if you were okay and you said you had the flu, which wasn't entirely a lie because you felt physically sick, nauseous, exhausted, headachy from crying. You went through the stages of grief and fast forward. Denial that this was really happening, bargaining with a universe that didn't care, depression that felt like drowning. But on the third day, something shifted. You woke up angry instead of sad, and that anger burned away the fog of despair and gave you something to work with. Something to channel into action. This wasn't just about you. How many other students had he done this to? The question hit you while you were in the shower on that third morning, and suddenly you couldn't stop thinking about it. Professor Carter had been at this university for over 20 years. He taught required courses that every student in your major had to take. How many desperate students had sat in his office over the years, asking for help, showing vulnerability? How many had he identified as potential targets? Students with financial problems, family crises, immigration status issues, any kind of leverage he could exploit. The statistical probability that you were his first victim was essentially zero. There had to be others, maybe dozens of others, scattered across 2 decades of teaching. Some had probably given in to his demands, carrying that trauma and shame in silence. Others had probably refused like you did and failed his class, their academic careers derailed by his retaliation. How many had given in because they felt they had no choice? This question haunted you more than any other because you'd come so close to being one of them. If he'd been slightly more subtle, slightly less explicit in his demands, if he'd framed it differently or caught you on a weaker day, you might have convinced yourself to comply. You understood viscerally how someone could make that terrible calculation: survival over dignity, future over self-respect, the degree you needed over the integrity you wanted to maintain. Those students who had given in weren't weak or complicit. They were victims who'd been backed into an impossible corner by someone with power and no conscience. And if there were students who'd submitted to his coercion, that made him not just an inappropriate professor, but a predator, a serial abuser who'd been operating with impunity for years. You started documenting everything, saving all his inappropriate texts and emails, writing down dates and details of every uncomfortable interaction, and the process of creating this record was both therapeutic and re-traumatizing. You went through your phone and took screenshots of every text message he'd ever sent you, all the late-night messages and the demands for immediate responses and the personal oversharing and the thinly veiled threats when you'd tried to set boundaries. There were over 300 messages spanning 6 weeks, and seeing them all compiled together, you could see the patterns so clearly: the escalation from professional to personal, the increasing entitlement to your time and attention, the manipulation tactics he'd used. You created a folder on your laptop and saved everything, labeled with dates and organized chronologically. The emails were fewer but more damning in some ways because they came from his official university email address, creating an institutional record he probably thought he could control or delete, but that existed on university servers. You forwarded all of them to your personal email account and saved PDFs as backup. Then you opened a new document and started writing down everything that hadn't been captured in text: the errands to pick up his dry cleaning, the coffee runs, walking his dog every weekend, the late-night office meetings when the building was empty. For each incident, you noted the date as precisely as you could remember, the time, the location, what was said, how it made you feel, any witnesses who might have seen you there. The document grew to 15 pages single-spaced, a comprehensive record of 6 weeks of systematic boundary violations and abuse of power. Noting the errands he'd made you run and the late-night meetings, you paid special attention to documenting the escalating pattern because you knew that's what investigators would look for. The dry cleaning pickup seemed almost innocent at first glance, but you noted how it became a weekly requirement and how he'd never offered to reimburse you for gas or the one time you'd had to pay for his order because he hadn't left money. The coffee runs were documented with dates and your bank statements showing the charges from the coffee shop, proof you'd been spending your own limited money on his expensive preferences. The dog walking was documented with the spare key he'd given you to his house, which you still had and which proved you'd been given access to his private residence. Highly inappropriate for a student-professor relationship. The late-night meetings were the most concerning items in your documentation, and you'd noted every single one with as much detail as possible. 9 meetings total, all between 10 p.m. and midnight, all in his office when the psychology building was otherwise empty. You noted what was discussed, rarely anything actually related to your coursework. Usually his personal problems or rambling conversations that seemed designed to keep you there and establish inappropriate intimacy. You noted how the door was always closed, how he'd sometimes lock it so we won't be interrupted, how he'd sit too close on the small couch in his office instead of maintaining professional distance across his desk. You noted the time you'd left each meeting often after midnight, and how uncomfortable and unsafe you'd felt walking to your car alone in the dark parking lot. You reached out to other students in his classes, carefully asking if anyone else had experienced anything strange, and this was the scariest part of building your case. You didn't know who you could trust, who might report back to Professor Carter, who might think you were crazy or vindictive. You started with students you'd become friendly with during the semester, 3 women who you'd studied with occasionally and who seemed kind and trustworthy. You asked each of them individually to coffee, saying you needed to talk about something confidential and serious. Your heart pounded during each conversation as you worked up to the actual question, trying to gauge their reactions, terrified they'd look at you like you were making things up or blame you for what had happened. The first student, Jessica, listened to your carefully worded questions about whether Professor Carter had ever asked her to do anything that seemed inappropriate or crossed professional boundaries. Her face went pale and she set down her coffee with a shaking hand. "Oh my God," she said. "I thought I was the only one. I thought I was imagining things or being too sensitive." She told you that he'd asked her to babysit his kids twice, had made comments about her body, had texted her late at night with questions that had nothing to do with class. She'd felt uncomfortable but hadn't labeled it as harassment, had just tried to keep her distance and avoid being alone with him. She'd gotten a C in the class despite doing good work, and now she wondered if that grade was punishment for not being more accommodating. 3 other students came forward, all with similar stories of boundary violations and inappropriate behavior, and each conversation made you more certain this was a pattern, not isolated incidents. The second student, Amanda, had a story that made your blood run cold. Professor Carter had asked her to his house to review a project just like you. When she'd arrived, he'd been drinking and had made explicit sexual advances. Unlike you, she'd frozen, hadn't known how to refuse, and had ended up sleeping with him because she felt she had no choice with her grade hanging in the balance. She'd felt disgusted with herself ever since, had struggled with depression and anxiety, had almost failed her other classes that semester because she couldn't focus on anything except what had happened. She'd never told anyone because she blamed herself. Thought people would say she should have just left, that her compliance made her complicit. The third student, Marcus, because it wasn't just women he targeted, you learned, told you about a similar pattern of personal errands and boundary violations. Professor Carter had figured out Marcus was struggling financially and had offered to help out by giving him paid work doing yard work and home repairs. It had seemed legitimate at first, but then the work had expanded to include personal assistant tasks. And Professor Carter had become controlling and possessive, texting constantly, making comments about Marcus's body when he worked without a shirt in the heat, making Marcus profoundly uncomfortable but feeling trapped by the money he desperately needed. Marcus had eventually cut off contact and taken the F in Professor Carter's class rather than continue the arrangement, setting his graduation back a full year. One girl had actually dropped out the previous semester because of him, too ashamed and scared to report it, and finding Emma was like finding the missing piece that made the whole picture clear. Jessica had mentioned her. There was this girl last semester, Emma something, who just disappeared halfway through the term. I heard she dropped out suddenly and nobody knew why. You'd managed to track her down through mutual friends on social media, sent her a careful message explaining you were a current student dealing with Professor Carter and asking if she'd be willing to talk. She'd called you that night and the first thing she'd said was, "He did it to you too, didn't he?" Her voice had been filled with guilt and regret, like she felt responsible for not warning you somehow. Emma's story was worse than yours. She'd been an international student, already vulnerable because of visa concerns and unfamiliarity with the American university system. Professor Carter had identified her as a target early in the semester, had made the same kinds of demands that escalated the same way, and she'd eventually given in because she was terrified of failing and losing her student visa and being deported. She'd slept with him multiple times over several months, hating every second of it, feeling trapped and violated and unable to see any way out. When the semester ended, she'd withdrawn from the university entirely, unable to face the possibility of having him as a professor again or running into him on campus. She transferred to a school in another state, had lost credits in the transfer, and was still dealing with the psychological aftermath of what she considered rape, sex obtained through coercion and under duress, without genuine consent. Too ashamed and scared to report it, Emma told you she'd considered filing a Title IX complaint dozens of times, but had always talked herself out of it. She was afraid she wouldn't be believed, afraid her immigration status would somehow be used against her, afraid of public scrutiny and her family finding out what had happened. She admitted with shame in her voice, felt complicit because she'd technically agreed to the arrangement, even though she'd felt she had no real choice. The self-blame was strong in her words, and you recognized it because you'd felt it too. The way victims of coercion often blamed themselves for not fighting harder, not refusing more clearly, not somehow preventing their own victimization. You told her none of it was her fault, that what had happened to her was sexual assault regardless of the technicality of her compliance, that coerced consent wasn't real consent. You contacted the Title IX office at your university and filed a formal complaint, providing all your documentation, and this step took immense courage. For days you'd stared at the Title IX website, reading about the complaint process, trying to understand what would happen if you reported. The unknowns were terrifying. How long would it take? Would it be public? Would you have to face Professor Carter? What if they didn't believe you? What if you went through this whole process and he faced no consequences? You'd almost talked yourself out of it a dozen times, but then you'd think about Amanda's depression, Marcus's derailed graduation, Emma's forced transfer, and you'd know you had to at least try. Not just for yourself but for all of them, and for whoever would come after if nobody stopped him. The coordinator's face grew more serious as you showed her the evidence, the texts, the witnesses, the pattern of behavior, and you could tell within the first 10 minutes that she believed you and understood the severity of what you were reporting. Her name was Dr. Patricia Williams, and she'd been the Title IX coordinator for 6 years, which meant she'd probably seen a lot of cases and knew when something was credible versus fabricated. You'd brought printed copies of everything, all the screenshots organized chronologically, your 15-page document detailing every incident, bank statements showing the coffee purchases, the spare key to his house, even a photo of his dog that you'd taken on one of your walks that proved you'd been at his residence. You'd also brought signed statements from Jessica, Amanda, and Marcus, each describing their experiences with Professor Carter. Dr. Williams looked through everything carefully, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, and her expression grew increasingly grim. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. 6 weeks, you told her. "But based on the other students I've talked to, he's been doing this for years. One of them dropped out entirely last semester because of him." You showed her Emma's contact information and explained you'd gotten her permission to share her story with investigators. Dr. Williams nodded slowly, processing the implications of multiple victims over multiple semesters. "And he explicitly propositioned you for sex in exchange for passing his class?" she asked, needing to confirm the most serious allegation. You nodded and showed her the texts from that night, the ones he'd sent after you'd left his house. "You're making a huge mistake. Last chance to be smart about this." The threat was barely veiled. She told you this was serious and they'd investigate immediately. And the mixture of relief and fear you felt hearing those words was overwhelming. Relief that someone in authority believed you and was taking it seriously, fear about what came next, and whether you'd be able to handle the process. Dr. Williams explained that Professor Carter would be notified of the complaint and placed on administrative leave pending investigation. There would be interviews with all the involved parties, review of evidence, possibly a hearing depending on what the investigation uncovered. She warned you it could take weeks or even months to fully resolve. She also warned you that you might face retaliation or pressure to drop the complaint, and that if anything like that happened, you should report it immediately. She gave you her direct phone number and told you to call anytime, day or night, if you felt unsafe or threatened. I need you to understand something, Dr. Williams said, looking at you with both compassion and seriousness. You're incredibly brave for coming forward. Most students don't. And based on what you've shown me, I believe this complaint has substantial merit. But I also need to prepare you for the fact that this won't be easy. The investigation process can be grueling. You'll have to tell your story multiple times. Professor Carter will have the opportunity to respond and defend himself. Some people might not believe you or might blame you. Can you handle that? Because once we start this process, there's no going back. And I need to know you're prepared for whatever comes. You took a breath and thought about Amanda's trauma. Emma's forced transfer, the hypothetical future student who might be spared this experience if you followed through. I can handle it, you said, hoping it was true. I have to. The university launched a formal investigation, and Professor Carter was placed on administrative leave, and the news spread across campus faster than you could have imagined. Within 24 hours of your complaint being filed, an email went out to all students enrolled in Professor Carter's courses, informing them that he would not be teaching for the remainder of the semester due to personnel matters, and that a substitute instructor would be taking over. The email was deliberately vague, following standard protocol, but it didn't take long for rumors to start circulating. Students talked. People speculated. Your name wasn't supposed to be public. Title IX complaints were meant to be confidential, but somehow word got out that a student had filed a complaint against Professor Carter, and within days people were trying to figure out who it was. You felt exposed before the investigation had even really begun, like a target painted on your back. But things got worse before they got better, and the backlash came from directions you hadn't anticipated. You'd expected Professor Carter to defend himself, maybe expected some people to doubt your story, but you hadn't been prepared for the organized campaign to discredit you and protect him. It started with the psychology department faculty, many of whom had worked with Professor Carter for years and considered him a colleague and friend. They saw the complaint not as a serious allegation against a predator, but as an attack on one of their own, and their first instinct was to circle the wagons and protect their department's reputation. Several professors made public statements to their classes about due process and the presumption of innocence, which seemed reasonable on the surface but felt like coded messages that the complaint was probably false. Some of his colleagues defended him, calling him a dedicated educator and suggesting students were making false accusations to get better grades. And those suggestions were made both privately and in ways that reached you through the student grapevine. Dr. Helena Morrison, another psychology professor who'd been on faculty for decades, apparently told her research methods class that she was deeply troubled by the trend of students weaponizing Title IX, complaints to retaliate against professors who hold them to high academic standards. She didn't mention Professor Carter by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. The implication was clear. You were a vindictive student upset about your grade, making false accusations to get revenge or to avoid the consequences of your own academic failures. The characterization made your blood boil because it flipped. The entire situation. You became the aggressor and he became the victim. Other faculty members circulated a petition expressing support for Professor Carter and calling for a fair and expedited investigation. The petition, which dozens of professors signed, praised his 20 years of dedicated service to the university and his commitment to academic excellence. It called the allegations against him concerning, but urged the administration not to rush to judgment based on unsubstantiated claims. The existence of this petition was leaked to the student newspaper, which ran a story about the controversy that was maddeningly both sides about the whole thing. The article mentioned that sources say the complaint involved allegations of sexual harassment and grade coercion, but gave equal weight to the faculty defending Professor Carter and questioning the credibility of student complaints generally. Reading that article made you feel sick. Your trauma, Amanda's assault, Emma's forced departure, all of it reduced to campus controversy fodder. You received anonymous messages calling you a liar and attention seeker, and they came through every possible channel once people figured out you were the complainant. Someone had put together the pieces. You were in Professor Carter's class, you'd failed. The complaint was filed right after grades were posted. Your Instagram and Facebook, which you'd thought were private, started getting message requests from accounts with no profile pictures. You're ruining an innocent man's life for attention. We all know you just failed his class and want revenge. Lying about sexual harassment makes it harder for real victims to be believed. You're a disgrace. The messages were vicious and unrelenting, and even though you tried to ignore them, each one felt like a small cut that added to the larger wound of going through this process. Some were more explicitly threatening. Drop the complaint or you'll regret it. We know where you live. Careful walking to your car at night. These messages you screenshot and forwarded to Dr. Williams immediately, as she'd instructed. She took them seriously, filed additional reports with campus police, and the university sent you information about safety resources and offered to relocate you to a different dorm if needed. But the damage was done. You no longer felt safe on your own campus. You started looking over your shoulder constantly, varying your routes to class, avoiding walking anywhere alone after dark. The psychological toll of feeling hunted and threatened on top of dealing With the investigation itself was exhausting, in ways you couldn't have anticipated. Some students blamed you for disrupting their classes when a substitute had to take over, and this was perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the backlash because it came from people who should have been on your side. The substitute professor who took over Professor Carter's courses was competent, but taught differently, had different expectations, and changed some of the grading criteria for remaining assignments. Students who'd been doing well under Professor Carter's system felt disrupted and blamed you for the change rather than blaming him for the behavior that had made his removal necessary. "This is so unfair. I was getting an A and now I don't know what to expect." One student complained loudly in the hallway after class, clearly intending for you to hear. Whoever made that complaint screwed us all over. You wanted to scream at them that Professor Carter had been abusing his power and sexually coercing students for years, that the disruption they were experiencing was nothing compared to the trauma his victims carried, that their grade concerns were not more important than stopping a predator. But you couldn't say any of that without outing yourself as the complainant, and you were supposed to maintain confidentiality even though it felt like everyone already knew anyway. So you sat in class avoiding eye contact with the students who glared at you, listening to them complain about the inconvenience of having their professor changed mid-semester, feeling like you were being punished for doing the right thing. The isolation was crushing. You'd already lost friends who'd graduated or who you'd stopped seeing during your mom's illness. And now you were losing any sense of community on campus because you were too controversial to be around. Professor Carter himself sent you a message through a lawyer, threatening to sue for defamation, and receiving that legal letter was terrifying in ways you hadn't expected. It arrived by certified mail, requiring your signature, and when you opened it and saw the law firm letterhead and the formal legal language, your hands started shaking. The letter, from a firm that specialized in defending professionals accused of misconduct, stated that Professor Richard Carter vehemently denied all allegations made against him and considered them to be malicious, false, and defamatory. It claimed your complaint was retaliation for your academic failure and that you'd manufactured evidence and coerced other students to support your fabricated narrative. It threatened a civil lawsuit for defamation, seeking monetary damages for harm to his reputation and career if you did not immediately withdraw your complaint and issue a public apology. The letter went on to say that Professor Carter had retained the firm to vigorously defend his good name and reputation, and that they were prepared to pursue all available legal remedies against those who have made false and malicious statements. They gave you 10 days to withdraw your complaint and issue an apology, or else they would proceed with filing a lawsuit. The threat was clearly designed to intimidate you into dropping the complaint, a common tactic predators and their lawyers use to silence victims by making the cost of speaking up seem too high. You called Dr. Williams immediately, barely able to speak through your panic, and she calmly explained that this was expected, that she'd seen it many times before, and that the university's legal counsel would help protect you from these intimidation tactics. The university lawyer would represent your interests, and you weren't alone in this. But knowing it was a common tactic didn't make it less scary. You'd never been threatened with a lawsuit before, never had to think about depositions and discovery, and the possibility of being sued for defamation for telling the truth about what had happened to you. The lawyer's letter made you second-guess everything. Had you said anything that wasn't completely accurate? Had you exaggerated in any way? Could something you'd said in your statement be twisted to make you look unreliable? The self-doubt was toxic and exactly what the letter was designed to create. You spent hours rereading your complaint, checking it against your documentation, terrified you'd made some error that would be exploited to destroy your credibility and bankrupt you with legal fees. You felt exposed and vulnerable, second-guessing whether speaking up had been worth it, and there were dark moments during those first few weeks of the investigation when you seriously considered withdrawing your complaint. The constant anxiety, the anonymous threats, the social isolation, the legal intimidation, the faculty defending him, the students blaming you, all of it combined into a crushing weight that made you understand viscerally why so many people don't report abuse. It wasn't that victims were weak or didn't have evidence. It was that the process of reporting was designed, whether intentionally or not, to be so punishing that staying silent seemed like the more survivable option. You weren't just fighting Professor Carter. You were fighting an entire system that protected powerful men and treated accusers with suspicion and hostility. Your mom, despite her own health struggles, became your biggest supporter, reminding you that standing up to abusers was never easy but always necessary. And her unwavering belief in you became the anchor that kept you from giving up entirely. You'd finally told her the full story one evening when the stress had become too much to carry alone. You'd driven home, walked into the kitchen where she was sitting doing a crossword puzzle between chemo treatments, and just started crying. The whole story came out. Professor Carter's coercion, the sexual proposition, the failed grade, the complaint, the backlash, the legal threat, all of it. You told her you were thinking about withdrawing the complaint because you didn't know if you could survive the rest of the process. And you waited for her to be disappointed, or to tell you to just let it go and focus on retaking the class. Instead, your mom set down her crossword puzzle, took your hands in hers, her hands that were thin and fragile from the chemo, and said, "Baby, I'm so proud of you for fighting back. What he did to you was evil. And I know this is hard, I can see how much it's costing you, but you can't let him win by making you give up. Think about all the other girls he's hurt. Think about all the future girls you might be saving. Men like him count on us being too scared or too tired to fight. That's how they get away with it for so long." Her eyes were fierce despite her weakened body, and you could see the strength that had carried her through decades of working multiple jobs, through her cancer diagnosis, through every challenge life had thrown at her. "You're stronger than you think you are," she continued. "You got that strength from me, and we don't back down from bullies no matter how powerful they are. reminding you that standing up to abusers was never easy but always necessary. Your mom shared a story you'd never heard before about her own experience with workplace sexual harassment decades ago. She'd been in her 20s working at a factory when her supervisor had started making inappropriate comments and then demands. She'd reported him and had been labeled a troublemaker, had lost that job, had struggled to find another one because word got around that she'd caused problems. But the supervisor had been fired too, and she'd heard years later that she wasn't the only woman he'd targeted, that her complaint had given others courage to come forward. "It cost me," she said. "I won't lie and say it didn't, but I've never regretted it because I know I stopped him from hurting other women after me." That's what you're doing now. It's costing you too, but it's worth it. You have to believe that. Your mom's support gave you the courage to continue when everyone else's doubt might have broken you. She accompanied you to meetings with Dr. Williams when she was feeling well enough, sat in the waiting room as a physical presence of support. She fielded the angry phone calls from your dad who wanted to drive to campus and confront Professor Carter directly, calming him down and explaining that vigilante justice would only hurt your case. She helped you draft a response to the lawyer's letter with the university's legal counsel, sitting beside you and squeezing your hand when the legalese became overwhelming. She reminded you daily that what you were feeling, the fear, the doubt, the exhaustion, was normal and didn't mean you were weak or wrong. Her belief in you became a lifeline you clung to when your own belief wavered. The investigation interviewed multiple students and staff, reviewed his communications, and examined grade patterns. And as the formal process unfolded, it became clear that the investigators were taking your complaint seriously and conducting a thorough review. Dr. Williams and her team interviewed you multiple times, walking through your timeline in excruciating detail, asking questions that sometimes felt intrusive but that you answered as honestly as possible. They interviewed Jessica, Amanda, and Marcus, each of whom provided statements corroborating the pattern of behavior. They contacted Emma, who initially was terrified to participate because she'd transferred schools and wanted to move on, but who ultimately agreed to provide a written statement and participate in a phone interview after you personally called her and explained how important her testimony was. They found evidence of preferential treatment for students who cooperated with him and mysteriously poor grades for those who set boundaries. And this was perhaps the most damning discovery, because it showed the systematic nature of his abuse. The investigators gained access to Professor Carter's gradebook and email records going back 5 years, university property that he couldn't hide or delete. They found patterns that were statistically unlikely to be coincidence. Female students who'd had multiple office-hour meetings, scheduled late at night, received significantly higher grades than their exam scores would predict. Students who'd emailed setting boundaries or declining requests received grades that were consistently harsh compared to the rubrics. One student who'd blocked his number after he'd texted her at 2 a.m. saw her grade drop from a B to a D over 3 weeks, despite improving test scores. The investigators also found email exchanges between Professor Carter and students that crossed obvious professional boundaries, discussions of personal relationships, comments about appearance, requests for favors that had nothing to do with academics. They found that he'd shown a pattern of targeting vulnerable students, single parents, students with financial difficulties, international students, anyone who appeared to have additional stressors that might make them feel they had no choice but to comply with inappropriate requests. The predatory pattern was so clear in the data that even someone who wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt couldn't ignore it. He'd been selecting victims systematically, exploiting their vulnerabilities systematically, and punishing resistance systematically, all while maintaining a facade of being a dedicated educator. Other former students came forward with stories going back years, and this snowball effect was both validating and heartbreaking. Once the investigation became known and word spread that the university was actually taking it seriously, students who'd graduated years ago started reaching out to Dr. Williams' office with their own experiences. Some had been too scared to report at the time, but felt safe doing so now that someone else had already opened the door. Some had reported to other authorities, department chairs, academic advisors, and had been dismissed or told to handle it themselves, but now saw an opportunity to have their experiences included in a formal investigation. Some had never labeled what happened to them as harassment or abuse until they heard other women's stories and recognized their own experiences reflected back. The pattern was undeniable. At least 15 students over a 10-year period came forward with complaints, ranging from boundary violations to quid pro quo sexual harassment to what several characterized as sexual assault by coercion. Not all were as severe as what you'd experienced, but all followed a similar blueprint. Identify a vulnerable student, offer help with their grade situation, gradually escalate inappropriate requests, leverage the grade as a threat to ensure compliance, and punish anyone who resisted. The investigators found that Professor Carter had refined his tactics over the years, learning what worked and what he could get away with, escalating his behavior as he became more confident that the university system would protect him rather than his victims. The breadth and duration of his predatory behavior was staggering, and it raised serious questions about how he'd operated for so long without being stopped. Several former students testified that they had tried to report him to department chairs or deans years ago, but their complaints had been minimized or dismissed. One woman said she'd been told, "That's just how Professor Carter is. He's very friendly with students, but it doesn't mean anything." Another said her academic advisor had suggested she was misinterpreting normal mentorship. Another had been told to try to avoid being alone with him, rather than the university taking action to address his behavior. These failed early reports showed a systemic failure. Professor Carter hadn't operated in complete secrecy. People had known or suspected, but the institutional response had been to protect him and dismiss complaints, rather than investigate them seriously. That pattern of institutional protection was its own kind of scandal, and you could see Dr. Williams's anger growing as she uncovered how many warning signs had been ignored. The mounting evidence created a turning point in campus opinion. The student newspaper, which had initially taken a both-sides approach, ran a follow-up investigative piece detailing the multiple complaints and the pattern spanning years. The article included anonymous interviews with several victims and made it clear this wasn't about one disgruntled student, but about a professor who'd systematically abused his position. Other campus publications picked up the story. Student government passed a resolution calling for stronger Title IX protections and better oversight of faculty conduct. Suddenly, you weren't the villain disrupting classes. You were the brave whistleblower who'd exposed a predator. The shift in narrative was dizzying and came with its own complications. Now people wanted to treat you like a hero when you just felt exhausted and traumatized, but it was better than being called a liar. The anonymous threatening messages stopped. Once it became clear the investigation was substantiating the claims. The faculty petition supporting Professor Carter quietly disappeared from circulation. Some of the professors who'd publicly defended him issued carefully worded statements about supporting the investigative process and taking all allegations seriously. It was a cowardly retreat. None of them apologized for rushing to defend him or for suggesting students made false accusations, but at least the active opposition to your complaint diminished. You could walk across campus without feeling like everyone was staring and judging. You could check your messages without bracing for another attack on your character. The relief was immense, though it couldn't undo the damage those weeks of backlash had done to your mental health and sense of safety. 3 months after you filed your complaint, the university announced its decision. Professor Carter was terminated for multiple Title IX violations, abuse of power, and sexual harassment. And the day you received that email from Dr. Williams, you were sitting in the campus library trying to study for finals in your other classes. Your phone buzzed with her message. "Can you come to my office? We have the results." Your heart immediately started racing because you'd been waiting for this moment for months. Had been told the investigation would take 8 to 12 weeks, but it had stretched longer. And every day of waiting had been agony mixed with dread about what the outcome might be. You packed up your things with shaking hands and walked across campus to the administration building, trying to prepare yourself for disappointment because you'd learned not to expect justice, not to trust that systems would work the way they were supposed to. But when you sat down across from Dr. Williams and she slid the official report across her desk to you, the words on the page were clear and unambiguous. The investigation had substantiated multiple allegations of sexual harassment, quid pro quo demands for sexual favors in exchange for grades, abuse of power, retaliation against students who refused his advances, and creating a hostile educational environment. The report detailed findings from interviews with 17 students, review of thousands of emails and text messages, analysis of grade patterns that showed systematic bias, and testimony from several faculty members who admitted they'd heard rumors about Professor Carter's inappropriate behavior, but had failed to report it. Based on these findings, the report concluded, Professor Richard Carter's employment with the university was terminated effectively immediately, his tenure revoked, and he would be barred from any future employment with the university system. He lost his tenure, his reputation, and his career, and while part of you felt guilty for the severity of the consequences, you'd been raised to be kind, to give people second chances, to not want to destroy someone's livelihood. The larger part of you felt overwhelming relief and vindication. This man who'd seemed so powerful and untouchable, who'd wielded his authority like a weapon to coerce vulnerable students, who'd counted on institutional protection and victim silence to continue his predatory behavior for years, was finally facing real consequences. His 20-year career was over. His name would forever be associated with sexual harassment and abuse of power. Any attempt to teach elsewhere would be haunted by this termination. The power differential that had made him so dangerous was permanently dismantled, and he could never again use a grade as leverage to exploit a student. Dr. Williams explained that the university's decision had been unanimous among the investigative panel and had been endorsed by the provost and president. They'd found his conduct to be egregious and sustained, representing a fundamental betrayal of the student-teacher relationship and the values of this institution. The report would be kept in his personnel file permanently, and while they couldn't criminal charges themselves, they'd referred the evidence to local prosecutors who would determine if criminal charges for sexual coercion or assault were warranted. Dr. Williams told you that your courage in coming forward and your meticulous documentation had made this outcome possible. Most of these cases come down to he said, she explained. But you gave us a clear pattern, multiple witnesses, contemporaneous evidence. You built a case that was impossible to dismiss. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. Here, the university offered you and the other affected students the option to retake the course with a different professor or have your grades administratively adjusted, attempting to repair some of the academic damage Professor Carter had caused through his retaliatory grading. The letter from the registrar's office explained that any student who'd received a failing or unexpectedly low grade in Professor Carter's courses could petition to have the grade removed from their transcript and either retake the course or receive credit based on their work in other classes and their overall GPA. It was an unprecedented accommodation, an acknowledgement that Professor Carter's grading had been compromised by his misconduct and couldn't be trusted as a legitimate assessment of students' academic performance. Several students took the administrative adjustment, just wanting to move on and graduate without spending another semester on a class that had traumatized them. You chose to retake it, wanting to earn your degree legitimately, and passed with a B+, and that decision surprised some people who thought you'd want to take the easier path and just accept the administrative credit. But you needed to prove to yourself that you could pass this course on your own merits, that you understood the material and deserved your degree based on your actual academic abilities, rather than administrative compensation for having been victimized. You enrolled in advanced statistical methods the following fall with Professor Jennifer Huang, a woman who'd recently joined the faculty and who had a reputation for being both rigorous and supportive. Walking into that first class was harder than you'd expected. The same course number, the same material. Sitting in a classroom in the same building where Professor Carter had taught triggered anxiety you didn't fully anticipate. But Professor Huang's teaching style was completely different. And experiencing what a normal professional student-teacher relationship looked like helped you understand how abnormal Professor Carter's behavior had been. Professor Huang held office hours in a common study area with windows and other students around, not behind closed doors late at night. She responded to emails during business hours with clear professional language about coursework, not at 2 a.m. with personal oversharing. She gave clear feedback on assignments that was about the work itself, not about your appearance or your willingness to do her personal favors. She treated all students with the same respect and maintained appropriate boundaries that made the learning environment feel safe. You realized that what you'd experienced with Professor Carter wasn't just a professor being too friendly or boundary challenged. It was systematic predatory behavior that looked nothing like normal academic mentorship. The coursework itself was challenging but rewarding, and you threw yourself into it with energy you'd been unable to muster the first time around when you'd been dealing with your mom's cancer and working 2 jobs and eventually being sexually harassed by your professor. This time you could focus purely on learning, and you discovered you actually enjoyed statistical analysis when it wasn't tainted by trauma. You formed a study group with other students who met weekly at the library, creating the kind of supportive academic community you'd been denied the first semester. Your mom's cancer was in remission, which freed up mental and emotional energy. You'd quit one of your jobs and taken out a small additional loan so you could focus more on school. And without the constant anxiety of managing Professor Carter's demands and boundary violations, you could actually concentrate on the material. When final grades were posted and you saw the B+ next to advanced statistical methods, you felt pride that had nothing to do with the grade itself and everything to do with what it represented. You'd survived something that was meant to break you, had fought back against a system designed to silence you, had rebuilt your academic career from the ashes of that failed semester. The B+ meant you understood the material, yes, but more importantly, it meant you'd reclaimed your education from someone who'd tried to use it as a weapon against you. You'd proven that Professor Carter's F hadn't been a reflection of your abilities. It had been punishment for refusing to be exploited, and now everyone knew it. Your transcript would show that retaken course with a good grade, and if any future employer ever asked about the gap in your graduation date, you could tell them honestly that you'd stood up to a predator and won. You graduated 1 semester late, but you graduated with your integrity intact and the knowledge that you'd protected future students from the same abuse. And walking across that stage in December to receive your diploma was one of the most meaningful moments of your life. Your parents and your sister sat in the audience, your mom wearing a hat to cover her still growing hair after chemo, thinner than she'd been but healthy and cancer-free, crying tears of pride as your name was called. You wore your cap and gown with honor, knowing that this degree represented more than just 4 years of academic work. It represented surviving trauma, fighting institutional power, refusing to be silenced, and maintaining your principles even when doing so came at tremendous cost. The 5-month delay in graduation that had seemed like such a disaster a year ago now felt insignificant compared to what you'd accomplished. After the ceremony, Dr. Williams found you and your family in the crowd and introduced herself to your parents. Your daughter is extraordinary, she told them. What she did, coming forward, building a case, withstanding the backlash, seeing it through to the end, required more courage than most people ever have to demonstrate in their entire lives. She stopped a predator and changed this university for the better. You should be very proud. Your mom hugged you tight and whispered, "I told you that you were stronger than you thought." Your dad, who'd wanted to handle the situation with his fists a year ago, squeezed your shoulder and said, "You did the right thing the right way. That takes real strength." Even your younger sister, who'd been in high school during the worst of it, looked at you with something like awe. "You're kind of a badass," she said, and you laughed because she was right. You had become someone different, someone stronger. The university implemented new policies requiring office hours to be held in public spaces and better reporting mechanisms for students facing harassment. Direct results of your case that would benefit students for years to come. The new policies, announced in a university-wide email at the start of spring semester, mandated that all office hours with individual students take place in locations with windows and visibility, ending the practice of closed-door meetings that had enabled Professor Carter's escalating behavior. Faculty were prohibited from asking students to perform personal errands or favors unrelated to their academic work. There were new mandatory training programs for all faculty about appropriate boundaries and power dynamics. The Title IX office got increased funding and staffing. Most importantly, there was a new online reporting system that allowed students to report concerns anonymously and a promise that all reports would be investigated, rather than dismissed. The policy changes were included in a statement from the university president acknowledging that the institution had failed to protect students from Professor Carter and pledging to do better. It was more accountability than you'd expected from an institution that typically protected its reputation above all else. But you suspected they'd been advised by lawyers that taking responsibility and implementing reforms would reduce their liability if victims decided to sue. Regardless of the motivation, the changes were real and would make future reporting easier and safer. Your lawyer, the university had helped you retain a civil rights attorney to advise you through the process, negotiated a settlement that included your tuition for the retake course, compensation for emotional distress, and a written apology from the university. The settlement was confidential, but you knew other victims were negotiating similar agreements, and the total cost to the university would be substantial. Your story inspired other students to come forward about different professors and situations, creating a wave of accountability on campus that extended far beyond Professor Carter's case. The student newspaper ran a series of investigative articles about sexual harassment and abuse of power in various departments, and students started sharing their experiences more openly instead of suffering in silence. 2 other professors were investigated for inappropriate conduct based on complaints filed in the months following Professor Carter's termination. One was given a written reprimand and required to undergo training. The other was placed on probation with strict monitoring. A teaching assistant was fired for having a sexual relationship with an undergraduate student in his discussion section. The culture was shifting from one where these behaviors were tolerated or ignored to one where they were recognized as serious violations with real consequences. Creating a wave of accountability on campus, your case had become a reference point and a source of courage for others. Students you'd never met would stop you to say thank you, to tell you that your bravery had given them permission to report their own experiences or to set boundaries they'd been afraid to set before. One young woman told you she'd been dealing with a professor who was texting her inappropriately, and after seeing what happened with Professor Carter, she'd immediately reported it instead of trying to handle it alone. The behavior had been addressed before it could escalate. "You probably saved me from going through what you went through," she said. "I can't thank you enough." Those conversations were emotionally overwhelming but also deeply meaningful. They confirmed that the pain you'd endured had served a purpose beyond your own case. The faculty climate had changed too, with professors more aware that inappropriate behavior would be taken seriously, and students more empowered to speak up. You heard through the grapevine that department meetings now included discussions of appropriate boundaries, that faculty were being more careful about how they interacted with students, that the assumption of protection for senior professors had been shattered. Some faculty resented the increased scrutiny and complained about walking on eggshells or not being able to be friendly with students anymore, which told you those were probably the professors who'd been engaging in boundary violations they'd previously considered acceptable. But the vast majority of faculty, the good professors who'd always maintained appropriate relationships with students, welcomed the clarity and the accountability. One professor told you privately, "We've known for years that some of our colleagues were inappropriate with students. It's a relief to finally see consequences." What Professor Carter had meant to be your breaking point became your turning point, from victim to advocate, from powerless to empowered, and looking back a year later, you could trace the trajectory of your transformation. When you'd first walked into his office begging for help, you'd been desperate and vulnerable, willing to accept almost anything to achieve your goal of graduating. You'd seen yourself as powerless, subject to forces beyond your control, someone to whom things happened. Through the process of being exploited, hitting bottom, deciding to fight back, and seeing it through despite tremendous obstacles, you'd discovered reserves of strength you hadn't known you possessed. You'd learned that power wasn't just something authority figures held over you. It was something you could claim for yourself by refusing to accept mistreatment, by documenting abuse, by speaking truth, by persisting when silence would have been easier. You didn't just fight for your own passing grade. You fought for every student who'd been manipulated and every future student who'd be spared, and that broader purpose had sustained you through the hardest parts of the process. When the anonymous threats had made you want to quit, you'd thought about Amanda and Emma and the other victims who deserved justice. When Professor Carter's lawyer had tried to intimidate you with legal threats, you'd thought about the hypothetical future student who might be spared his predation if you saw this through. When the social isolation had made you feel alone, you'd remembered that you were actually fighting for a community of survivors, even if you didn't know all their names. The fight had never been just about you, and that's why you'd been able to endure costs that might have been too high if only your own interests were at stake. And that, you realized, was worth more than any grade could ever be. The knowledge that you'd stood up for something larger than yourself, that you'd refused to let an abuser's power go unchecked, that you'd made your campus safer for others. The degree you'd earned was important, and you were proud of it, but it wasn't the thing you were most proud of from your college experience. What you were most proud of was the moment you'd decided to fight back instead of accepting victimhood, the months you'd persevered through investigation and backlash, the courage it took to tell your story over and over to investigators and reporters and other survivors. You were proud of becoming someone who could sit across from your younger sister and tell her honestly that standing up to people who abuse their power is hard but necessary, that systems can change when people refuse to stay silent, that your voice matters even when powerful people try to convince you it doesn't. Your mom's cancer remained in remission, which felt like its own kind of justice. She'd fought her battle with illness while you'd fought your battle with institutional abuse, and you'd both survived. She attended a campus event where you and several other survivors were recognized by the student government for your advocacy work. And afterward, she told you that watching you speak publicly about your experience was one of the proudest moments of her life. "When you were born, I hoped you'd grow up to be strong and brave and someone who'd stand up for what's right," she said. "You've become all of that and more. You didn't just survive what he did to you, you've helped others survive and prevented future harm. That's the best kind of strength there is." You'd been offered a job at a victims advocacy nonprofit, working with survivors of sexual assault and harassment, helping them navigate reporting systems and connect with resources. The job paid less than the corporate marketing position you'd originally been offered. That offer had been rescinded when you'd delayed graduation, but it felt more meaningful. Your experience with Professor Carter and with the Title IX process had given you insights and empathy that would help you support others going through similar traumas. You were still dealing with your own healing, still in therapy, still having occasional nightmares about being trapped in his office, still struggling with trust issues and anxiety, but you were using those struggles to better understand what other survivors needed. Pain that's processed and used to help others becomes purpose, your therapist had told you, and you were finding that to be true. The last you heard about Professor Carter, he'd been unable to find another teaching position. The termination for sexual harassment had effectively ended his academic career. He'd apparently tried to rebrand himself as an education consultant, but had been publicly called out by former students every time he tried to build a platform. His LinkedIn profile had been flooded with comments from survivors sharing their experiences. His attempts to present at conferences had been met with protest. The professional reputation he'd built over 20 years had been permanently destroyed, and while you took no pleasure in his suffering, you felt satisfied that he could no longer hurt students. The last predatory text he'd sent you, "You're making a huge mistake," had turned out to be prophetic. But he'd been the one making the mistake by assuming he could continue his behavior without consequences. On the 1-year anniversary of filing your complaint, you visited Dr. Williams' office to thank her for believing you and fighting for you through the process. She hugged you, which was unusual for her professional demeanor, and told you that your case had changed how she approached investigations. "You reminded me why this work matters," she said. "It's easy to get burned out dealing with bureaucracy and politics, to forget that behind every case number is a real person whose life has been affected. You were so brave and so determined, and you made my job easier by being so organized and clear. But more than that, you reminded me that when we do this work well, we can actually change things. We can stop perpetrators and protect future students. Thank you for giving me that reminder." You left her office and walked across campus, the same campus where a year ago you'd felt hunted and vulnerable, but now you felt it belonged to you as much as to anyone. You'd earned your place here not despite what had happened, but in some strange way because of it. You'd learned that universities were imperfect institutions run by imperfect people, capable of both enabling abuse and correcting course when forced to confront uncomfortable truths. You'd learned that speaking up was terrifying and costly, but also powerful and necessary. You'd learned that you were stronger than you'd ever imagined, capable of enduring and fighting and winning even when the odds seemed impossible. And you'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for becoming the person you were meant to be, not in spite of the trauma, but through the process of refusing to let it define or destroy you. As you walked past the psychology building where Professor Carter's office had been, you felt nothing but relief that his door was now occupied by someone else, that his name had been removed from the faculty directory, that students walking these halls would never have to fear him. You'd done that, not alone. There had been other survivors and advocates and investigators and administrators who'd played crucial roles, but you'd been the one who'd started the process, who'd refused to stay silent, who'd built the case that couldn't be ignored. That knowledge would stay with you forever, a source of strength you could draw on whenever life presented new challenges. You'd face down a predator and an institution and your own fear, and you'd won. Whatever came next in your life, you'd face it knowing exactly how strong you were and exactly how much your voice mattered. And that was worth more than any grade, any degree, any career achievement could ever be.